Morning. This is the recording for Thursday, October 6th regarding the Civil War. Today, the warm-up is to ask several questions about turning points. What is a turning point? How is something a turning point and not just a change? And give a few examples of turning points that you have seen in your lifetime. Think about your answers to those, and to help you begin starting up on this lesson, those ones are not test questions. They are just having you think about the material, make some connections. Speeches and battles can be turning points. Throughout the war, there were several speeches that swayed public opinion, guided strategies, and significantly altered the course of the United States. During the course of the war, several battles also changed the tide of the war. The end of the war was in 1865, but it was not the end of conflict. This is a quote by John Stuart Mill, who was a politician in England, and he says this about the American Civil War. The triumph of the Confederacy would be a victory for the powers of evil, which would give the courage to the enemies of progress and damp the spirits of its friends all over the civilized world. The American Civil War is destined to be a turning point, for good or evil, of the course of human affairs. I want you to think about this end part I have in bold. What does that part of the quote tell us about the United States' impact on global events? I want you to think about how this shows that the United States is having increased influence throughout the world, that they are a country that other countries are looking at to pay attention to, take inspiration from, to see them as a leader. This is another quote by the same person. He says, "The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not sufficient warrant or justification." How does this quote relate to the power struggle between the North and the South in the Civil War? Though here, people have been arguing that slavery is a necessary evil, that it's something that needs to occur so that other people, the white people, can make profit. And here, John Stuart Mill is saying that should not be how it is. People's own good is not a justification for causing evil upon others. Radical Republicans is going to be our topic for tomorrow. Thaddeus Stevens was the leader of the Radical Republicans. He provides the South with supplies, fortifications, food, and convinces Lincoln to make war over slavery. Lincoln is an abolitionist, and that is strategic because he can get support from Britain and slow Southern production by saying this. Lincoln's new war aim was to abolish slavery, if that's what it took to preserve the Union. And that is some context for the Emancipation Proclamation, which occurred in 1863. It freed the enslaved people in Confederate states that were not under Union control. It doesn't really free anyone because those southern states are not going to be following US law. They're following the Confederacy law, so they will be ignoring that US law that just passed. Therefore, it doesn't really free anyone, just symbolic freedom. Slavery is maintained in the border states. Why do you guys think that might be? To try to maintain their support during this controversial time. If they had decided to ban slavery there, it might have convinced those states to turn to the Confederacy. This gives the war a moral cause and gives them more support from Europe. Davis remember, the Confederacy president, is determined to fight until the end with no turning back. Let's recap what we just discussed. What is the Emancipation Proclamation? How did it affect enslaved people? Now, remember, we just talked about that on the last slide. The Emancipation Proclamation is a speech that Lincoln gave that freed all the enslaved people from the Southern states, the Confederacy states. But it didn't really truly affect them at all because the Confederacy leaders would be ignoring that law, and it didn't free any enslaved people in the border states or any Union states. Lincoln struggles with recruitment during this war. By early 1863, the number of military men volunteering for service declines to almost none. Lincoln issued a conscription, the Civil War Military Draft Act. The Confederacy also enacted a draft. What is a draft? A draft requires all male citizens 18 and older to submit their name that could possibly be pooled to go into war. People did not like these drafts. They called it a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. These riots caused 100 people to die as a direct result of the draft. And this mainly occurred in the North, even though both the Confederacy and the Union had laws for the draft. This is a significant battle that occurred in the Civil War, Vicksburg in 1863. Grant was, remember, a Confederate general, ordered a destruction of rail lines to distract the South away from the port city. Caused 47 days of constant bombardment. This was a turning point in the war, coupled with Gettysburg. This helps turn the war in favor of the Union. The Confederate soldiers are asking to give up because they have no food. Remember, yesterday we talked about one of the advantages that the Union has over the Confederacy is access to farmland that grows plentiful food. Vicksburg was a Union victory. They got control of the Mississippi River, and it divided the Confederacy and pitted them against one another. Oops. Gettysburg is a turning point of the war. Lee knew it was essential to invade the North, but this was a Union victory nonetheless. This was Lee's, remember that is one of the Confederate generals, his worst defeat. He attempted to resign, but Jefferson Davis refused to accept. This crushed Southern morale. What was the importance of the Battle of Gettysburg? This is a turning point in the war. It was it made the South lose their morale. It was General Lee's worst loss that made him want to resign. You can say any of those. Lincoln's new commanding officer is Ulysses S. Grant. He is given command of the entire Union force in 1864. He is answerable only to President Lincoln. The South would run out of men even with the draft, as there were 60,000 people dead in the first fight. The South thought about arming the enslaved people, and they believed in unconditional surrender, no negotiations, immediate surrender. And he became known as Unconditional Surrender Grant. This is another one of Lincoln's new commanding officers, William T. Sherman. He is a Union general who introduced modern warfare in the sense of total war, destroying everything and attacking civilian targets, not civilians. So rather than just fighting other people who are also in the military, he would attack regular everyday people. He says, "You cannot judge war in harsher terms than I will. War is cruelty, and you cannot refine it. And those who brought war into our country deserve all the curses and maledictions a people can pour out." Sherman said this regarding the expulsion of civilians from Atlanta. In the election of 1864, Lincoln's popularity is slumping due to the length of the war and the number of people who have died. Despite the negative appeals, Lincoln does win, and Andrew Johnson becomes the vice president. He is a Southerner. Lincoln is working on a plan to reunite the nation after war, but he will never live to see it set into motion. But why would Lincoln choose a Southerner as vice president? People often do this even today. They will pick a vice president who helps round out their ticket. They'll pick someone who has some opposite beliefs, someone who's different from themselves to attract people from the other's viewpoint. The March of the Sea occurred from 1864 to 1865. Sherman led the Union troops through Georgia and up through South Carolina. He utilized total war where he expelled citizens from Atlanta and burned the city. They destroyed rail lines, warehouses, fields, etc. This also further crushed Southern morale. They liberated 225,000 enslaved people. They gave food and supplies to North Carolina and did not destroy Wilmington. This was a Northern victory. Shortly after this, the fall of Richmond occurs when Sherman and Grant march to Richmond. Davis, remember that is the Confederacy president, flees and sets the city on fire. Richmond falls in 1865, and this is the last of the Anaconda Plan to be achieved. Robert E. Lee's farewell address is his surrender. So let's take a minute to just read this and answer the question, according to this speech, why did Robert E. Lee surrender? Headquarters, Army of Northern Virginia, 10th of April, 1865. General Order Number 9. After 4 years of arduous service marked by unsurpassed courage and fortitude, the Army of Northern Virginia has been compelled to yield to overwhelming numbers and resources. I need not tell the survivors of so many hard-fought battles that who have remained steadfast to the last, that I have consented to the result from no distrust of them, but feeling that valor and devotion could accomplish nothing that could compensate for the loss that must have attended the continuance of the contest. I have determined to avoid the useless sacrifice of those whose past services have endeared them to their countrymen. By the terms of agreement, officers and men can return to their homes and remain until exchanged. You will take with you the satisfaction that proceeds from the conscience of duty faithfully performed, and I earnestly pray that a merciful God will extend to you his blessing and protection. With an unceasing admiration of your constancy and devotion to your country, and a grateful remembrance of your kind and generous consideration for myself, I bid you an affectionate farewell. So here he is saying that too many people have died. Really, this is the paragraph that answers the question. Avoid the useless sacrifice of additional people. He felt that the win would not compensate for the loss of these lives. 5 days after the war, Lincoln is assassinated by John W. Booth while watching the play Our American Cousin. Lincoln dies the next day, and Andrew Johnson becomes president of the United States. Here are Union side papers that say things like $100,000 reward for the murderer of our late beloved President Abraham Lincoln. The murderer is still at large. 50,000 reward, 25,000 reward, 25,000 reward. So there's rewards for information about the person who killed him. Here we have a photo depicting the death of the president. He is looking well respected. People are weeping. He is surrounded by his family as he lays in bed dying. Now this is from the Confederate side. It says Lincoln shot, condition considered hopeless, will not live through the night, doctors declare. Our loss, the great national calamity, death of the president. We also have glorious news, Lincoln and Seward assassinated. Lee defeats Grant. Andy Johnson inaugurated president. How do the Northern and Southern newspapers compare? For example, the Northern newspaper said, death of the president, $100,000 reward for the murder. And the Southern newspaper said, glorious news, Lincoln assassinated. How do those compare? So it's saying that the North is upset that they have lost their president, while the South is not. They think that is glorious news. All right, now I'm going to pass out posters for each of your groups. Each of your group has a document in the middle of your poster. Group 1 has the Emancipation Proclamation. Remember, this is the document that Lincoln gave that freed the enslaved people. One group has the Gettysburg Address. This was one of those turning point speeches, because remember, the Battle of Gettysburg was a turning point in the war. So this helps him to lift people's spirits in the Union and expand on that win. We have Lincoln's first and second inaugural address. An inaugural address is the speech when they are elected president. So this one's the first and then the second address here. We have an African-American soldier asking for equal pay. This is a letter that they write to ask for equal pay as they serve in the military. We have an article on Fort Sumter from the Fremont Journal. And we have an article on Fort Sumter from the Daily Dispatch. Those are all the articles. So essentially, I have some analysis questions at the bottom. I want you to highlight the answers to them, draw arrows. You can just highlight an answer and draw an arrow. You can write the answers on the outside of your poster. You don't have room to write it right there next to the question. So I want you to utilize drawings, arrows, other forms of graphic organization, writing the answers in a performative way on the sides, and make your poster for your group's given source. All right, after we do this for about 20 minutes, then we are going to rotate to the other groups, Each group is going to have a different color marker, so like a green group, red group, yellow group, and so forth. And these groups are going to rotate to the other groups to add annotations to each of the other groups' posters. And that means annotate means highlight things, draw arrows, make connections, add on to their answers. If they've highlighted a quote that they think supports an answer, and find a different quote and say that supports the answer as well. If there is an opinion question here, you can agree or disagree. If they've cited one form of evidence and you see evidence in the article from the other side, you can point that out. Anything like that. Add your thoughts and feelings, add connections to the material from today, anything like that. And then, so here's some instructions for that. I think that that will take the whole time so that you won't have to do a poster chart, but I'll make one in case there's some extra time. If you're watching this because you're absent, you don't need to make anything up from this activity. This is an in-class activity. And then you just have the exit ticket. Let's take a look there. Oops. Right, you're gonna say, answer the question, pretend your friend was absent from class today. What are the three most important things about this lesson that you would tell them? That is your exit ticket. All right, I will see you in class if you're coming in today.